Hello, this is The Jay Show, and this is Dr. Jay Smith here in London with our beautiful Sarah Foster. She has been coming on with us now for 10 shows, 10 episodes. Just do a quick snapshot. We looked back at why is it that the slavery existed in Christianity and why it existed in Islam, but it didn't really exist in Christianity, did it? As we've been finding out. For the first 300 years, there was no slavery. For the first 300 years, there was no warfare. For the first 300 years, there was no even context of a colonial power or of any state. The idea of the state at the beginning of Christianity didn't even exist.
No slave trade.
Not at all. And there was not even a state there because Christ said very clearly when asked about who to pay taxes to. In Matthew, he said, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, give to God what belongs to God, separating church and state. So there was not even a concept of an idea that there should be a Christian state, to say nothing of the whole edifice of a state then creating slaves and bringing in slaves to then keep that state afloat like we have in Islam. And many people will say, well, hold on a minute, what about the Crusades? What about the fact that there was slavery in Christianity? And certainly, though the Crusades was not an enslavement, it was to bring back the Holy Land. People will say, yes, but Christianity has certainly has used barbaric means, it has used warfare. How would you answer that? Because that's not slavery so necessary, but it's very much like, you might say, Islam trying to take over land and trying to take over peoples.
Yeah, so we readily acknowledge that people using the name of Christ have done some really horrific things and barbaric things. We don't deny that whatsoever. But we always get to the book and the man, which is your saying, Jay, the book and the man. What did Jesus do? Did Jesus enslave anyone? Did he kill anyone? Did he advocate that anybody do that? Any of his followers do that?
Even did he get defended by anybody?
No, he refused to even be defended by violence. His faith was in something much greater. And so when we see things that have happened through history using the name of Christ, we have to bring it back to, did Jesus do it? Is this what we learn in our Bible? And when we think
WWJD, remember that phrase that people used to wear?
Yeah.
What would Jesus do?
What would
Always
Jesus
come back
do?
to what would Jesus say? What would Jesus do in that situation? And how would Jesus what would he have done with the Crusades?
Well, so this is a tricky one. So with the Crusades, the Crusades just didn't happen in a vacuum. It didn't happen from nowhere. We have Islam spreading out of Arabia in the 7th century, and they don't stop. As we've looked at in previous sessions, the jihad was offensive. It was we hear Muslims saying that they only defend. It was only attack to defend, but it was an offensive jihad, and it went out across Africa, across Europe, and into Asia. And so it's going into all these Christian lands that haven't even, troubled the Islamic lands at all. And so
this was not defensive, this was absolutely offensive.
It was offensive. And so these Christian lands decided to take a stand. Now what they should have done is done it in the name of their state. So if the Byzantines wanted to go to war, if the French wanted to go to war, then they should have gone in the name of France. Us as French people are going to go and fight back against your invasion. But the mistake was trying to do it in the name of Christ. And this is where the confusion comes in, because Christ certainly said, just don't do that.
And it all has to do with bringing church and state together, which Constantine did in the 4th century, when as an emperor, he became a Christian, was converted, and then made the state Christian. Christ never intended that.
Well, it was the emperor after him.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so Constantine made Christianity not illegal anymore. So now Christians can practice their faith without being fear of, taken and being burnt at the stake or thrown to the lions. And it was the ruler after him, I've forgotten his name for a second, but he was the one who said now he's going to enforce Christianity on the rest of the empire. That's the mistake, because Christianity is all about a change in the heart, and you can't force that on anyone.
There's no idea of a state at all. We don't have a hierarchy in Christianity. No. We're all priesthood of all believers. There's no idea of a king. In fact, remember the whole thing that we did in the last episode of washing as servants of Christ, wash the feet of the disciples. So that would not make sense in a context of a state. And he does say in Romans 13 that we're to obey governments, that we're to submit to governments, that God puts governments there in place. But we're not to use the machinations of a state, like the weapons of this world. And 2 Corinthians 10, that we don't use weapons of this world. We use But we are to use principalities and powers. We're to use arguments.
Yeah.
And that's what we're doing in this show. We're using arguments and take every thought and make it captive to Jesus Christ.
Yeah, Jesus dealt with this in the Gospels. His disciples went to him and said, when are you going to overthrow the Romans? You know, the Romans were like an occupying force. And
Yeah.
what are you going to do? They were looking for a king. This is why there was confusion. Is he the Messiah? Is he not the Messiah? We want him to deal with the Romans. And Jesus is saying, my kingdom is not of this world.
Even the disciples of John, when John was in prison, came to him and said, come and help
Yeah.
your cousin John.
Yeah.
And he says, you go back and tell John what I'm doing.
Yeah.
He did not go to save his cousin. He purposely said, look and see what I'm doing. I'm healing the sick. I'm
Yeah.
giving sight to the blind.
Yeah.
I'm about my own God's work. I'm about my God's work. I'm about my Father's work.
Yeah.
And it was very clear that his ministry was not to overthrow the Romans.
Yeah.
He purposely wasn't there to do that or to join the Zealots.
Yeah.
He was not there to overthrow Herod and to free his cousin. So we've got the Crusades, which is really what you're saying. It's an aberration. It should never have happened under
Yeah.
the name of Christ.
300 years of Islamic invasion, there had to be a halt to it because it would have overrun Europe. They shouldn't have done it in the name of Christ. They should have done it in the name of the states.
Like we do wars today, when
Yeah.
wars happen today all the time. It's the state. Muslims always confuse and assuming that George Bush did it in the name of God, in the name of Jesus Christ. No, they don't. We don't
He
use
doesn't.
Allahu Yesu when we go into battle.
No.
We don't do that because it's very well known, that very clear that we do separate church and state, and we've got it. We're starting to get it correct now. Now let's get back to slavery as it exists. Let's go back and let's start with the whole abolition. Abolition means the eradication of slavery.
Yeah.
There was an abolition movement. The slavery did cease. That's why we don't have slavery today in most of the world. Slavery still exists, and you're going to show me where it still exists today. But let's start the abolition movement. What is it? Where did it happen? What are some of the dates? And let's look at the comparisons between the abolition movement in Christianity versus abolition in Islam, if they do exist.
Yeah.
And then let's look at some modern examples. Should we do that?
We can do that.
Okay, let's go ahead and look at the abolition thing. Now, go ahead and introduce this whole subject.
So we know that William Wilberforce was a very, very important figure. We know that the Quakers, another Christian group, William Wilberforce was a Christian.
Wilberforce, for those who don't know what we're talking about, he is here in Britain.
Yes.
He is part of the Clapham sect.
Yeah, he was.
And we're talking about late 1700s, early 1800s. In fact, we're talking about 1807 to be specifically. So let's back up on this, so people, because a lot of people will not know
Yeah.
who these people are.
So slavery has been going on, and as we saw, the Islamic slavery, which was taking Europeans captives, was happening at the same time of the transatlantic slavery when Europeans were taking Africans over to the Americas. So there was just all kinds of confusion, and we know it didn't just happen here, but there was stuff happening in India as well, and of course in the Middle East. So the world was just in chaos. There were some people who were holding on to their Christian faith. You have people like the Quakers. You have other Christian groups who were really holding on to their faith and looking at slavery and saying, this is not of God. And they were using verses like Genesis 1:26, where it says that man is made in the image of God. And now we're not saying that man is like God. We're not saying that, man is any way can be comparable to God. But when God chose to make us, he decided to give something of us, of him to us, which gives us inherent worth, which means I have no right to go and subdue my brother or kill my brother, because God saw that person special enough to make them and create them and let them exist on this earth. So who am I? Who are you? We are all equal. No one is better than anyone else. And so they use this understanding to say, the black man is our brother, and they use posters like, am I not a brother? Am I not a man? Am I not a woman? Am I not a sister?
This is the slogans they would use.
Yes, this is the abolitionist slogans. And it came straight out of the Bible, the understanding that everyone is made in the image of God, understanding
Genesis
that
1:26 and 27.
Genesis 1:26 and 1:27, and also that you shouldn't think of yourself more highly than you ought. And the conviction that Christ has set us free, so how dare we enslave other people? So there was lots of things going on. And the one who really spearheaded the abolition movement was a man called William Wilberforce. Very interesting character, very charismatic, the short guy, I'm told. And he became a politician, and he made it his life's work to get rid of slavery worldwide. He made it his life's work. That and the good manners. He wanted good manners back in the UK. And So this is what he did. He campaigned, he got together with like-minded people, and it was a slog. Sometimes he was beaten, he was opposed, sometimes the forces were against him. He and his team would gather evidence, what's going on the slave ships. Some people in Britain were being told that, look, they're enjoying it, it's very comfortable on these ships, and then they go to the Caribbean and they get to be by the beach and enjoy life. And they got the evidence to say, actually, that's not true. And so they just kept flogging and slogging away until there was breakthrough in 1807, when it was finally decided that they should stop the slave trade.
Okay, let's look at the dates now. We'll put it up on a slide here. The abolition of slave trade. There are the dates, 1807. Abolition of slave trade in the British Empire. Royal Navy began to arrest slaving vessels.
Yeah, so that's so intriguing with Britain. They didn't just do it in name only. They said, okay, we're going to stop it, and now we're going to put money behind that and make sure that people stop enslaving. So it actually came into law. It wasn't just it
wasn't like just a voluntary act.
Yeah.
It was enforced.
It was enforced. So the British did that, and then they started going around the world and really making their mark. 1815, it's the same time when Jefferson was dealing with the Barbary pirates. Britain paid Portugal £750,000 to stop trading north of the equator.
They actually put money where their mouth was.
They're not getting any of this money back. They are trying to stop the slave trade. So they've paid Portugal, and this is a vast amount of money in the 19th century. And so they just managed to do north of the equator. 2 years later, they paid Spain $400,000 to cease trade to Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Santo Domingo. So you can see they're running out of money. So not such a good idea, but then they've just started to form treaties now. So 1818, Britain-Spain Treaty to abolish the slave trade. Britain-Portugal Treaty as well to abolish the slave trade. 1826, they built this fort in the Gambia. I've actually been there, where it was specifically designed to stop, to fire cannons at vessels that were taking slaves from the Gambia. So they built that fort specifically to stop the abolition. That's the only fort built with that purpose. 1827, Britain and Sweden had a treaty. 1828, New York State abolished slavery. 1832...
New York State by itself, not America, but New York State. Okay, state by state by state. They'd have to go to 50 if it were today. But I can see this is really spearheading. Britain was right at the forefront of making sure that other countries did this as well.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
And some of it would have been economics, because they would have lost a large income in the slave trade, so they would have wanted to stop other people doing it as well, because then they'd be at a disadvantage. But I think a very good push, or the driving force, was the ethical force. There had been a swing in how people felt about it in Britain. Yeah.
Because economically they were getting hurt to begin with by virtue of the fact that they would not have the huge plantations full of free labor.
Yeah.
So they're going to have to pay for that labor now.
Yeah.
So that was going to be a huge economic disinvestment for them.
Yeah. So this was completely a change of heart towards it, because it was a disinvestment. It was bad for their investments. They paid the slave owners to give up their slaves effectively in order to...
They bought the slaves from them and freed them, I guess, is what you're saying.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Which has ethical issues, because the slaves didn't get any kind of compensation. But
what happened to the slaves?
They had to work about between 10 to 15 more years, and then they were free. And then maybe their slave owners would keep them on and maybe pay them, or they could go and find work.
But they got paid for what their work was, so
afterwards.
They became part of the system. Okay.
Yeah, afterwards. But that aside, Britain was very admirable in the way it was going around the world. You can see Britain and France Treaty, Britain-Denmark Treaty in 1835, 41, Britain, France, Russia, Perusa, a treaty to suppress the trade. Suppress the slave trade. 51, Britain-Portugal Treaty to stop trading south of the equator.
Okay.
43, Britain abolishes slavery in India. Britain and Uruguay, they have a treaty to suppress. Mexico, a treaty to suppress. Chile, treaty to suppress. Bolivia, they abolished it. In 1847, the Ottoman Empire finally abolishes...
So this is the first Muslim country. 1847. Finally, the Muslims are coming on board.
And this is after a lot of political pressure. 1848, we have Britain and Muscat to suppress.
Another Islamic.
Yep, and 49, Britain and the Persian Gulf to suppress. We have in 1860 indenture system to be abolished in India. And we have the Britain-US Treaty to suppress the slave trade. And then 1865, the US abolishes the slave trade. We have Zanzibar Treaty to suppress the slave trade, and same in Madagascar. 1874, Britain abolishes the slavery in the Gold Coast, which is Ghana. And 1902, Ethiopia abolishes slavery. China comes in at 1906. We have the whole convention to suppress. So now this is a group of countries now coming together agreeing that they're actually going to suppress the slave trade and slavery. Sierra Leone abolishes domestic slavery in 1928. We finally have the Declaration of Human Rights banning slavery globally. So
and
now,
that's what the Declaration of Human Rights, the Human Rights Declaration of Human Rights.
Yeah, United
was
Nations.
instituted. So that's Article 4 of that.
Yes.
UNADHR.
Yes. And then 52, this is now when more of the Muslim countries are coming on board. So Qatar in 52, China abolishes slavery in Tibet in 59, and then Niger in 1960.
We're in my age. This is when I was alive.
Yeah, 62, Saudi Arabia and Yemen. 63, United Arab Emirates abolishes slavery. 1970, Oman abolishes slavery. And then finally 81, Mauritania.
Isn't it interesting? All the last ones are Muslims.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, isn't it, that they're all Muslims, the last.
And it required a political will. There wasn't a change of heart.
There was no voluntary abolishment. This was really pressure from the United Nations. Well, fascinating. Wow. So when you look at the dates, that Britain was at the forefront of every one of these.
Yeah.
In the first cases, with Portugal and France even paying them.
Yeah.
I mean, sorry, Portugal and Spain even paying them.
Yeah.
That's amazing. That they 750,000.
They paid off their own slave owners in the UK and across in the Caribbean, and then they tried to pay off people, and they realised they couldn't do that for very long, so they went the diplomatic approach.
So when you look at the two, if you do a comparison between Christian countries and Muslim countries, when you look at them, and you've got it up here on your slide, go ahead and do a comparison real quickly.
Yeah, where we've seen Islam influence a country, where it's had a huge grip on a country, we've had to force them to stop slave trading and slavery. There hasn't been the political will to stop it, and nor can there be, because if it's an Islamic country, in its constitution is the Quran, and the Quran allows slavery. Think of Surah 4:24, where you can have those whom your right hand possess. And many times it's codified in the law that if you want to absolve yourself of some sin, you free a slave. How on earth can you make slavery illegal if Allah is saying this is part of a way you can absolve for, it's part of your sins? So there's no way theologically you can abolish slavery in Islamic influenced country, where in Christianity, as we've seen with the Bible, everything moves from slavery to freedom, and so there should be freedom. This is not a foreign concept, and this is why the will is there, because if it's founded on Christian doctrines, and if there's Christian people there, there's a desire that everyone should be free. Everyone should experience freedom because Christ has won it for them.
Well, good stuff. This is great. And when you stop and think of the Clapham sect, I mean, you even told me that there were actually African Americans who were left free, and then they also joined the abolition movement. Cases where Afro-Americans and Afro-Caribbeans did not just flee and go back and then live off the land. They went back and actually helped make sure that their brothers and sisters also were freed.
Yes.
So you had many people sacrificing themselves. The Quakers were long before there was even a hint of abolition. They were involved in it tens of years before that. Yeah. And it's their whole volition was because of what they read in Scripture. Yeah. It wasn't for them, well, I just want to feel nice to people next to me. No, it's because God was saying so. And because of the fact that existed. I want to ask you a question. Do you know of any abolition movement in Islam?
Not a movement, no.
There has never been an abolition movement?
Not one. You can have people who want to provide more rights to people and free slaves, but there hasn't been a groundswell, there hasn't been a public will to get rid of slavery.
So I can't name of one abolition movement.
There's no movements.
I mean, we have Liberia, which was created by, I think, by the United States to send freed slaves back to. The country itself is there today because of all the American slaves that came back to Africa. They didn't know where they were from. They didn't know what country. So the United States carved out this piece of land to send them back to. We do know of other. Sierra Leone is, again, a place for slaves in Africa, already in Africa, to return to. But where has Islam ever done this?
They haven't even recognized it. They don't even recognize the damage that they've done. They don't even recognize the harm that they caused to people. There's no repentance there, and so there hasn't been anything. I think there is one monument, I think, in Tanzania, but that's it. You talk to Muslims about slavery, all they think about is the transatlantic slavery, or it could be, you're allowed slaves, but they're people who are rightfully slaves because they're victims of war or they're captors of war, not thinking about what actually happened in history and how immoral it is. And how God cannot be like that. The God the real God, the God of the Bible cannot be like that.
I remember I was in, I think it was in South Africa, where they had a picture of Africa, and I remember seeing the map of Africa, and then they had the history of slavery, and they showed the west coast of Africa, and they showed all the countries where the slaves, and they were showing how a lot of the people, especially Nigeria, that they had enormous amount of people leave Nigeria and of course the whole West African coast. And you see all these arrows going over here, and you see all the countries they went to, lots of arrows going across the Atlantic. And then you had all these slave houses, Mombasa, Lamu, Zanzibar, huge slave houses, not one arrow going anywhere.
Oh.
And I just started looking at that, I almost had to laugh out loud.
Yeah.
Because there was no arrows going anywhere. The only thing they could have done is had an arrow coming down to the southern part of South Africa. You would think they'd have come down there, but everybody knows the ships couldn't get around.
So all the arrows were facing towards the transatlantic.
Huge clashing. That's where the two oceans come together. That's why they couldn't go around the south.
Yeah.
So where did all the, there was no arrows going anywhere. It was almost like they had taken erasure and erased them all off the map. And I had to laugh when I saw that.
Yeah.
And I said, well, how do you think Lamu became Lamu? Why is Zanzibar so well known today? Why do the Yao people out of Malawi, the Yao people were the slavers?
Yeah.
They were the ones that sold the slaves to the Arabs.
Yeah.
Where did they all go?
Yeah.
No arrows anywhere.
I was saying when I was in the Gambia, we heard of a slave, just a war of Arabs having Mauritanian slaves just down the road, not far at all. So it was abolished in Mauritania in 1981, but in 2017 there were still slaves about. And we know because also Baroness Cox, a good friend of yours, went over to Mauritania.
She went and she bought slaves on camera. She went to a slave house and went to an auction, bought them on camera, and then freed them. On camera, so that everybody could see that this was still existing today in the 20th century. It happened in the 20th century, not in the 20th. I think it was the 20th. I think it was the 1990s she did this. Proving that it's still modern slavery, still existing. And we're going to be going into that. We need to go into that now. So let's look at some modern examples.
Oh, where to start? So in the early mid-90s, we start to hear social workers becoming a little bit concerned because there's young people being trafficked and being sexually abused. This is what some social workers are starting to report. And so in 1997, a whole charity called Risky Business was set up to try and help these young people get out of this, get out of being trafficked and get out of this sexual exploitation.
Yeah. You're talking about young English girls.
Yeah, young English girls.
These aren't foreigners living in Britain.
No.
These are actually born and bred British girls.
Young English. But the Sikh communities were actually complaining about similar things before this as well. So
the Sikh, as in Sardarji, one with the turbans, for those who don't know what we're talking about. Okay.
Yeah, so in 2002, the Home Office drafted a report and they recognised there was a high prevalence, you see the quote here, of young women being coerced and abused through prostitution in Rotherham. And there they cited 270 victims at this time.
This is 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Victims of abuse. Senior council officials and police objected.
And this is the problem. They've done this report, they've identified 270 victims, but council officials objected, which means that they weren't happy with the report, and then it wasn't investigated.
Okay. Let's put this in context for those of you who are following. We've been talking about slavery in the past. We've been talking about slavery going in Europe, the European slave trade going from 1400 up to 1800, and then stopping in 1807. No more slavery after that. We've been talking about Islamic slavery that started in the 7th century. As long as Islam has been around, it's continued. So for 1400 years, 1,000 years longer. And it still exists, but we just gave the example of Baroness Cox in North Africa. We didn't really think of, hold on a minute, does slavery still exist today? Are there modern examples? We're now moving into modern examples where slavery still exists today in the context of what? What are we talking here? This is not really slave, there's not slave markets here. These are girls that are being enslaved. Their bodies are being enslaved, are they not?
Yeah, so in the previous examples, we see that it's part of the state. You can legally buy and sell slaves under the Islamic laws. But here in England, you can't do that. So what people have done to get around it is to traffic them, is to coerce them. Many of the girls say that they thought they'd meet a group of boys their age, and then gradually they'd be introduced to people who are a bit older than them, and then gradually they'd be introduced to people older than them, and they used to buy them food, they used to take them places, and then eventually they'd introduce drugs into the relationship, and before you know, they're being sexually exploited.
So this is called grooming.
They groomed them. And some of the girls were as young as 12 and 13. And
these were not Asian girls.
No. So the Sikh community was complaining about this first, but then we found out that there was a high prevalence of white girls, white English girls, who were being groomed, specifically being groomed by these Muslim gangs, Pakistani Muslim gangs.
So here's the sexual thing again. The same thing we saw earlier with what is unique about Islamic slave. It's almost women, always women. They want women. They don't want the men. Yeah. Well, now we're seeing a modern example of that here in Britain, and it's happening in the last 15 years. This is not ancient history. This is still going on today. And who are these Muslims? Who are they?
Well, we're going to get
so let's
to
move
that.
on. So that's 2002. Now we move into 2003. Yeah.
So we had the report. It was squashed, which is concerning in itself. Then Dr. Angie Hill gets on the case, and she again remarks on the significant number of girls that are being exploited, and some boys. And in 2006, she reports that there's an organised and established exploitation scene here in the UK. And then we find finally some convictions in 2010, just 5 people.
And these are them. You have them up there on the screen. Yeah. These are the 5. Now, all of them, where are they from?
What we can see, we know that they're all Muslim and they're all Pakistani. And this is 2010. We've spoken about 1,400 victims. Do you think these 5 people did 1,400? Whether it was responsible for 1,400 victims?
And that's just one city.
But what we see in 2012, they realise that it's much more widespread. And this is where they start to identify the problem. They say it was a network of Asian offenders, both locally and nationally.
Asian could be anything.
Yeah.
That could be Sikh and Hindu, couldn't it?
It could be Sikh and Hindu. And they said it's not just Rotherham, but Sheffield as well.
Even more so than Rotherham.
Yeah. So this is where we're starting to build up the numbers towards 1,400.
We're going to have to leave it there and come back to this, because we need to see that slavery is not just something that happens in the ancient world. It isn't something that just happens hundreds of years ago, or even something that has just stopped in 1981 with the eradication of, supposedly, at least legally, eradication of slavery in Mauritania. This is still continuing today. So you're going to bring in, we're going to continue with Rotherham. We're going to show that this is a real problem uniquely in the Muslim community.
Yes.
All right? We're going to leave it there. Thanks for being with us. We're going to continue with episode number 12. Come back and see exactly how this now gets carried out as we're speaking. It's still happening as we're speaking. This is Jay and also Sarah here in London. Over and out.